It started on a quiet Saturday morning that was supposed to be about nothing more dramatic than coffee, trimming the hedges, and finally fixing the loose board on the back fence. The kind of small suburban rituals that make you forget how fragile peace can be when power-hungry people decide to insert themselves into your life. Because at exactly 8:17 a.m., while I was halfway through my first mug and still in sweatpants, there came a sharp, authoritative knock at the front door that didn't sound like a neighbor asking for sugar or a kid selling fundraiser. Candy, but more like someone who expected obedience the moment would met knuckle. And when I opened it, there she was, Carolyn Whitmore, president of the HOA, self-appointed guardian of property values, queen of passive-aggressive. Emails standing on my porch with her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, and that familiar, tight smile that never reached her eyes. The one that said she wasn't here to talk, but to dictate, and before I could even say good morning, she launched into it, informing me in a clipped tone that my gate had been reported as non-compliant, that the HOA had reason to believe I was illegally restricting access to common areas, and that under Article 7, subsection C, she was authorized to demand temporary access to my property, including my house keys if necessary, to conduct an inspection, which was so absurd I actually laughed at first, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. But she didn't laugh back, just adjusted her glasses, and repeated the demand more slowly as if I were hard of hearing, telling me this was not optional and that refusal would result in escalation, a word she clearly enjoyed using. And I told her calmly that there was no common area on my lot, that the gate led to my fenced backyard, that no HOA bylaws allowed random inspections of the inside of my home, and that she certainly wasn't getting my keys. At which point her smile vanished and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret, and said that her husband was a police officer, that he was aware of the situation, and that she'd already spoken to him about my hostile attitude, implying very clearly that if I didn't cooperate, this would stop being an HOA matter and start being something else, something with uniforms and reports and consequences. And that was the moment my stomach tightened, because I heard stories everyone in the neighborhood had about how she used that badge by proxy to bully people, how a parking dispute suddenly became a citation, how a noise complaint turned into multiple squad cars at midnight. And while I'd always told myself those were exaggerations, here she was standing on my porch, trying to strong-arm me into handing over my house. Keys like this was some kind of authoritarian suburb where personal property existed only at the pleasure of the HOA. And I told her again, more firmly this time, that she was trespassing, that she needed to leave, and that if she had an issue, she could put it in writing like everyone else. And that's when she snapped, accusing me of hiding violations, of thinking I was above the rules, of being exactly the kind of homeowner who dragged down the community, her voice rising enough that a couple of curtains twitched across the street. And then she pulled out her phone and, without breaking eye contact, said she was calling her husband right now, that he was on duty and could swing by, and that once he explained things to me, I'd realize how serious this was. And I remember feeling that mix of anger and disbelief, the surreal sensation of watching someone misuse authority so casually, so confidently, as if the law were a personal accessory she could deploy whenever she didn't get her way. And I told her she was welcome to call whoever she wanted, but that my answer wasn't changing, and she stepped back onto the walkway, tapping furiously at her phone, narrating the situation just loudly enough for me to hear snippets like uncooperative, refusing access, and possible obstruction. And then she hung up and smiled again, that same thin smile, and said he'd be here shortly, that it would be better for everyone if I had the keys ready, because things could get unpleasant if I forced the issue. And at that point I told her flat out that she needed to get off my property, that if she didn't leave I'd call the police myself, which made her laugh outright, telling me to go ahead, that they'd side with her, that I didn't understand how things worked. And she finally turned and walked back down the driveway, stopping at the sidewalk to turn around and point at my house, saying this wasn't over and that people like me always learned the hard way. And as she stood there waiting, clearly expecting her husband to arrive any minute like cavalry, I closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding, trying to decide whether I'd just made a principled stand or a massive mistake. Because the reality of having a cop show up at your house at the behest of an angry HOA president is enough to make even the most law-abiding person second-guess themselves. And I replayed every word in my head, every tone, every gesture, wondering how it might look through the distorted lens of someone who already decided I was the problem. And while I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, I also knew how messy things could get when personal grudges mixed with official authority. And as I looked out the front window and saw Caroline pacing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, phone in hand, glancing down the street like she was expecting flashing lights at any second, I realized this wasn't just about a gate or a bylaw anymore. It was about control, about her need to assert dominance, and about whether I was about to be taught a lesson for daring to say no, and that. When my phone buzzed with a text from my wife saying she was on her way home early, something about a schedule change, and I stared at the screen for a long moment, unaware yet of how much that simple message was about to matter. The waiting was almost worse than the confrontation itself. Because once Carolyn had staked out her position on the sidewalk like a sentry guarding an invisible border, time seemed to stretch and coil, every passing car making my pulse jump as I stood behind the front window, pretending to tidy up while really just watching her pace back and forth, occasionally stopping to glare at my house as if sheer willpower might force the door open and the keys into her hand. And about 15 minutes later, a black and white cruiser rolled into the cul-de-sac, slow and deliberate, tires crunching softly against the pavement, and Caroline straightened immediately, smoothing her hair and squaring her shoulders. The transformation, almost comical as irritation, gave way to smug anticipation, because this was the moment she'd been waiting for. The arrival of reinforcement, and the cruiser parked directly in front of my driveway. Lights off, but presence unmistakable, and out stepped Officer Whitmore. Her husband, uniform crisp, expression already hardened into that neutral authority cops wear when they expect resistance. And even from behind the glass, I could see the familiarity in the way they exchanged a quick look. A subtle nod, the kind that said this conversation had already been rehearsed. And he approached my front door with purpose, hand resting near his belt, not aggressive but clearly meant to intimidate. And when he knocked, it wasn't a request but a command. 3 firm raps that echoed through the house. When I opened the door, he immediately filled the frame, its blocking light, presence dominating the threshold as he asked my name. Already knowing it, and told me he'd received a complaint about an uncooperative homeowner refusing lawful access to HOA representatives. His voice flat, professional, but carrying that underlying assumption that I was already in the wrong. And I told him calmly that no lawful access existed, that the HOA president had demanded my house keys without any legal basis, and that I had asked her to leave my property, which prompted him to glance back over his shoulder at Caroline, who had moved closer now, arms folded, chin raised, nodding along as if every word he spoke confirmed her righteousness. And he said that the HOA had broad authority to enforce community standards, that refusing an inspection could constitute interference, and that it would be in my best interest to cooperate to avoid things escalating further. And the way he said escalating made it clear he was talking about fines or letters, but about handcuffs and reports, about the kind of trouble that lingers even when nothing sticks. And I felt that familiar knot of frustration tighten because this was exactly what she'd planned. To weaponize his uniform, to turn a civil dispute into a show of force. And I told him again that there was no warrant, no court order, no emergency, that my property was private, and that demanding my keys was unlawful. And his jaw tightened slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction as he asked me if I was refusing a lawful order. I said I was refusing an unlawful demand, emphasizing the difference, which earned me a sharp look from Caroline as she cut in, telling him that I'd been hostile from the start, that I'd laughed at her, that I was hiding violations, maybe even something worse, planting seeds of suspicion with casual ease. And he nodded slowly, as if considering that, then told me to step outside so they could talk this out. A request that didn't feel like a request at all. And I declined, saying I was happy to talk right there. But I wasn't leaving my home, and that's when his tone shifted, becoming colder, more procedural, as he informed me that continued non-compliance could result in further action, that he could detain me while the matter was investigated. That resisting HOA enforcement wasn't something to take lightly. And all the while Caroline stood just behind him, watching me with a satisfied expression, clearly enjoying every second of my discomfort. And neighbors had started to gather now, not openly, but subtly, garage doors half open. People lingering on sidewalks, pretending to check mail while clearly listening, because nothing draws attention in a quiet suburb like a police cruiser and raised voices. and I could feel the narrative slipping out of my control, turning me into that guy, the problem homeowner, causing a scene. And I realized that even if this went nowhere legally, the damage socially could already be done. And I told the officer that if he believed a crime was being committed, he was free to act, but that I would not consent to any searches or hand over my keys, and he stared at me for a long moment, weighing his options. Because this was the line where things could tip from intimidation into outright abuse, and I could tell he knew it. And for a second I thought he might actually push it, might make an example of me just to reinforce the dynamic his wife relied on. But instead he stepped back slightly and said he was giving me one last chance to cooperate voluntarily, that this was my opportunity to resolve things amicably, and Caroline immediately chimed in, telling me not to be stupid, that this would all go away if I just did what I was told, her voice dripping with condescension. And I felt anger flared then, hot and sharp. Because the sheer audacity of it, all the entitlement, the misuse of power, the assumption that my home existed for their convenience was overwhelming. And I told them both that this conversation was over, that they needed to leave, and that any further attempts to enter my property would be considered trespassing. And the officer's expression darkened, his pride clearly stung. And he told me to watch my tone, reminding me who I was talking to. And that was when I heard another car pull up behind the cruiser. Tires stopping abruptly, a different engine note, and for a brief moment I assumed it was another neighbor or maybe backup. Caroline smiled again, certain this was further reinforcement. Then I saw her smile falter as she glanced back, confusion flickering across her face. And the officer turned as well, brow furrowing, because the car wasn't marked like a patrol vehicle. But the person stepping out moved with unmistakable confidence. And even before I fully registered what was happening, I felt a shift in the air. The subtle but powerful change that comes when the balance of authority starts to tilt. And Caroline took a step back. Suddenly uncertain, the officer straightened, attention drawn away from me for the first time since he'd arrived. And as the newcomer closed the distance, badge still clipped discreetly at their waist, not yet displayed. I realized that whatever Caroline thought she was controlling had just slipped out of her hands, and that the story she'd been so sure of was about to collide headfirst with a reality she hadn't anticipated at all. The moment my wife stepped fully into view, the entire dynamic shifted in a way that was almost physically perceptible. Like the air pressure changing before a storm because she didn't rush or raise her voice or announce herself dramatically. She simply closed her car door with calm precision and walked up the driveway with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who was not guessing where they stood in the hierarchy of authority. And it took only a second for Officer Whitmore to register that something was different, his posture stiffening as his eyes tracked her approach, uncertainty flickering across his face as he tried to place her, while Caroline's expression went from smug to puzzled to faintly irritated. Clearly assuming this was just my spouse arriving at an inconvenient time, another civilian who could be dismissed or talked over, and my wife stopped a few feet from the officer, looked at him directly, then at Caroline, then back at him again, and in a level, composed tone asked what seemed to be the simplest question in the world. "What's going on here?" And he started into his rehearsed explanation about an uncooperative homeowner and an HOA inspection dispute, framing it carefully to justify his presence and authority, but she held up a hand. Gently, not rudely, just enough to pause him, and asked whether he had a warrant, a court order, or exigent circumstances that justified demanding house keys or threatening detention. And the effect was immediate, because that wasn't the kind of question asked by someone bluffing or panicking. It was precise, technical, informed, and I saw his jaw tighten again. This time not with irritation, but with calculation. And he said no, there was no warrant, but that he was responding to a complaint. And she nodded once, then reached into her jacket and produced her badge, holding it up just long enough for him to see clearly before lowering it again, not flashing it theatrically, but making sure there was no ambiguity about what it represented. And I watched the color drain from Caroline's face in real time as recognition dawned, because this was not part of the script she'd written in her head. This was not how this story was supposed to go. And Officer Whitmore's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Shoulders pulling back, tone softening, authority recalibrating as he addressed my wife by her title. Suddenly very aware that this situation was no longer a casual intimidation exercise, but something that could have real professional consequences, and she explained, still calm, still controlled, that my home was private property, that the HOA had no legal authority to demand keys or conduct interior inspections without consent or court order, and that threatening detention under these circumstances could be construed as abuse of authority, especially given the personal relationship between the responding officer and the complainant. And as she spoke, Carolyn tried to interject, stammering about bylaws and community rules and how everyone knew her husband was just doing his job. But my wife turned to her then, eyes steady, and asked her to identify the specific statute or legal provision that granted her the right to demand entry into a private residence. And Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it again, scrambling, because bluster only works when no one calls it out. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely out of her depth. And neighbors who had been hovering at the edges now stopped pretending not to watch. The quiet street transformed into an audience to a power reversal that no one would forget. And Officer Whitmore cleared his throat, suddenly eager to de-escalate, saying there may have been a misunderstanding. Perhaps things had gotten heated, and that everyone should just take a step back, and my wife agreed, saying that would be wise, and then added very deliberately that she expected a full report of this incident, including the nature of the complaint, the lack of legal basis for the demands made, and the familial relationship involved, because transparency was important in maintaining public trust, and the word report seemed to hit him harder than anything else because I could see the mental math happening behind his eyes. The awareness that this encounter could follow him, that internal reviews and uncomfortable questions might be waiting down the line, and he nodded quickly, assuring her he would document everything appropriately, and Caroline, sensing the ground collapsing beneath her, tried one last time to regain control, insisting that the HOA would not let this go, that there would be fines, hearings, consequences. But my wife turned back to her and said with absolute clarity that any further harassment or retaliation would be noted, documented, and addressed through proper legal channels, and that misuse of law enforcement connections for personal disputes was a serious matter. And the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower and the rustle of leaves. And in that silence, Caroline finally seemed to understand that the authority she thought she wielded was conditional, fragile, dependent on no one pushing back. And now it had been exposed, and Officer Whitmore said he believed it would be best if everyone went their separate ways, that there was no reason for further police involvement. And he offered a stiff, professional nod to my wife, who returned it, and then he turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word. And Caroline stood there for a moment longer, looking around at the watching neighbors, at me, at my wife, her mouth set in a tight line, before spinning on her heel and marching back toward her house, clipboard forgotten at her side. And as the cruiser pulled away, and the street slowly returned to its usual quiet, my wife turned to me and asked if I was okay. And only then did I realize how tense I'd been, how tightly I'd been holding myself together, because the release came all at once. A deep breath I hadn't known I was holding, and as we stood there together on the porch, the sun higher now, the morning irrevocably changed. I knew that whatever came next, whatever fallout or retaliation or whispered gossip followed, one thing was certain: the illusion of Caroline's unchecked power had been shattered in front of everyone who mattered. And she knew it. The aftermath unfolded more slowly than the confrontation itself, but in many ways it was more revealing. Because once the immediate threat had passed and the street returned to its carefully curated calm, the ripples of what had happened spread through the neighborhood with a quiet inevitability. Neighbors who had watched from behind curtains or paused mid-walk, now finding reasons to wave, to stop, and talk, to ask carefully worded questions that were really just invitations to confirm what they already suspected. And within days it was clear that the story had taken on a life of its own, retold in driveways and group chats, stripped of Carolyn's self-importance and reframed as a cautionary tale about overreach and entitlement. And while no one said it outright at first, the unspoken understanding was that something fundamental had changed. That the HOA president, who once wielded fear and inconvenience like blunt instruments, had been publicly checked. And that kind of exposure doesn't fade easily, because people who rely on intimidation depend on the belief that no one will challenge them. And once that belief cracks, everything built on it becomes unstable. And sure enough, the emails from the HOA slowed, then softened, their tone shifting from accusatory to bureaucratic, violations now accompanied by citations of actual bylaws instead of vague threats. And when my wife and I attended the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was unmistakably different. Caroline still sitting at the head of the table, but no longer commanding it. Her voice sharper, more defensive, as residents asked pointed questions about authority, about inspection policies, about the appropriateness of involving law enforcement in civil disputes. Questions that would never have been voiced a month earlier. And when someone asked whether there was a conflict of interest in having a sitting HOA president married to a responding officer, the room went very quiet, and Caroline's response was rambling, evasive, lacking the confidence she once radiated. And while no immediate action was taken, the seed had been planted, and over the following weeks, that seed grew as formal complaints were filed. Not just by me, but by others who had their own stories, their own moments of quiet intimidation they'd previously swallowed for the sake of peace, and the pattern became impossible to ignore, and eventually the HOA announced a review of its enforcement practices. A dry phrase that nevertheless signaled accountability, and then came the resignation, framed publicly as a personal decision. A need to focus on family, but everyone knew the truth, knew that the position had become untenable. That power exercised without restraint had finally met resistance. And as for Officer Whitmore, his presence in the neighborhood diminished noticeably. The cruiser no longer a regular sight, his interactions with residents cautious, formal, as if every word now carried weight he hadn't considered before. And while I never learned the full extent of any internal consequences, I didn't need to. Because the real change was visible in the everyday rhythms of the community, in the way people spoke to one another, in the boundaries that were quietly but firmly reasserted, and for my part, life returned to normal in the most satisfying way possible. My gate unchanged, my keys exactly where they belonged, my home once again feeling like a refuge rather than a contested space. And sometimes I'd catch Caroline across the street or at the store. Her gaze sliding past me, no longer confrontational, just avoidant, as if acknowledging me would mean acknowledging everything that had unraveled, and I didn't feel triumph so much as relief, because this had never been about winning. It had been about drawing a line and holding it, about refusing to surrender basic rights for the illusion of harmony. And the experience left me with a deeper appreciation for how easily authority can be misused when it goes unquestioned, and how powerful, calm, informed resistance can be in restoring balance. And every now and then, when a new homeowner moved in and asked about the HOA, someone would smile and say, "Just know your rights." And I'd nod quietly, remembering that morning, the knock on the door, the clipboard, the badge, and the moment when fear gave way to clarity, and realizing that while the story would eventually fade into neighborhood lore, the lesson would endure, woven into the shared understanding that even in the most ordinary places, standing your ground can change everything.